Recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, when someone keeps something secret, it's often because it's embarrassing or negative or damaging or unsupportable. Over in the Senate, Leader McConnell and some of his Republican senators, Mr. Speaker, are doing just that, crafting a health care repeal bill in secret because they know what it would deeply embarrass anyone who supports it openly. They know it's going to be a hard sell to convince even their own Republican colleagues, Mr. Speaker, to get behind a bill that even President Trump called mean. That was the House American Health Care Act to which he was referring. He called it mean for the harm it does to Americans. They know it's going to be difficult in the Senate to convince senators to support a bill that raises health care costs for working families and kicks millions of Americans off their coverage, including those who are covered by their employers. A bill that makes millions of individuals with pre-existing conditions uninsurable and reinstitutes annual and lifetime limits. A bill that imposes an age tax on those between ages 50 and 64, increasing premium costs by as much as 800%. A bill that forces states to cut benefits and kick millions of people off Medicaid, whether it's next year, in 3 years, or in 7 years. Those times are to try to get by elections so that perhaps the people will not be held accountable for voting for such draconian legislation. Mr. Speaker, such a bill ought to be very embarrassing indeed, which is why Senator McConnell, I believe, and his allies don't want anyone to see it until they're asked to vote on it. We have a similar problem, of course, in the House. Whatever happened to transparency, to openness, to reading the bills, to posting it for all to see in advance? Where are all those people who wanted everybody to read the bills and see the bills? Where are they today in demanding that bills be fully and thoroughly vetted, read, heard, and voted on? It's no wonder even Republican senators who haven't seen the bill are getting angry with their leader and those drafting it in secrecy. Republican Senator Ron Johnson said last week, Mr. Speaker, quote, "I want to know exactly what's going to be in the Senate bill. I don't know it yet." And then he concluded, "It's not a good process." And Senator Marco Rubio said, and I quote, "The Senate is not a place where you can just cook up something behind closed door and rush it to a vote." But, Mr. Speaker, that's what we hear is exactly what's happening. Cooking it up in secret and rushing it to a vote. Now, Mr. Speaker, they're not the only ones who want to know what's in this bill. Millions of Americans are deeply worried about its contents. Last week, I sat down with two courageous Americans who shared their personal health care stories with me. I want to thank them for doing so, and I want to share their stories today. Their names are Ola Ojewumi and Megan Foley. Ola lives with a pre-existing condition. As a young child, she received a heart and kidney transplant. She's also a cancer survivor. She is a young woman. She told me about how the Affordable Care Act saved her life. She was able to access affordable coverage because of the ban on denying coverage to those with pre-existing conditions. Ola also told me how frightened she is that these protections could be taken away from her under the Senate's secret Trump Care bill. If it's enacted, Ola and others with pre-existing conditions may not be able to access the coverage needed to keep them alive and healthy, or they may simply not be able to afford it. When I spoke with Megyn Kelly, she shared her courageous story of struggle with mental illness and addiction. She told me how she overcame her addiction. Despite her recovery, before the Affordable Care Act came into effect, she was denied coverage again and again because her addiction was considered a pre-existing condition. Those were difficult months, cutting back on expenses and accruing debt just to pay for her medication, until the Affordable Care Act kicked in and allowed for Megan to obtain coverage. But she made it. And now the law protects Megan and millions of others like her struggling with addiction who were given a second chance. At a time when this country is plagued, Mr. Speaker, with an unprecedented opioid addiction crisis, the Republican repeal bill is an insult to courageous Americans for whom recovery is a lifelong process and access to care is essential. They and so many Americans are now living with uncertainty and fear for their future. Mr. Speaker, I'll be sharing my interviews with Ola and Megan on social media, and I encourage all members of this House to sit down with your constituents and listen to their stories and hear about their concerns. Americans deserve to know what's in the Senate's secret Trump Care bill and how it would impact them and their loved ones. Americans deserve to know. Senators who represent those Americans need to know. And they have not seen it yet there is some discussion that they may have to consider that as early as next week. Senators and members of this House deserve to know. End the secrecy. Pull back the curtain. Let us see what's in that bill that these senators think is so embarrassing that it must be hidden from us all. I will remind Republicans both in the House and in the Senate, and the Republican president in the White House, that their party's control of our government is complete, and they will be held responsible for whatever happens to our health care system on their watch. CBO tells us that 23 to 24 million people, as a result of the House bill, would lose their insurance. The pre-existing conditions would be put at risk, that over $800 billion would be cut from Medicare and Medicaid. Mr. Speaker, I urge all of us to listen to Americans, to hear how beneficial the Affordable Care Act has been. I hope they'll listen to Ola. I hope they'll listen to Megan and all those who are concerned for the future, and not huddle in a secret back room making decisions that will negatively impact millions and millions and millions of our fellow citizens. Do the right thing. Do it for Ola. Do it for Megan. Do it for all of our citizens. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Maryland yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe, for 5 minutes.